Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a world that feels almost impossibly distant. An empire that refused to collapse, not through endless conquest or dramatic last stands, but through something quieter, stranger, and perhaps far more enduring: patience. This is the story of how the Byzantine Empire peacefully survived. The night air over Constantinople carried the scent of salt and oil lamps. From the high sea walls, the water of the Bosporus shimmered faintly, reflecting scattered stars like broken glass. Below, the city breathed in a slow, steady rhythm. No panic, no marching armies, no burning outskirts, just the soft murmur of a civilization that had learned, over centuries, how not to fall apart. It had not always been this way. There had been a time when the empire trembled constantly, when enemies pressed from every direction, when emperors rose and fell like tides, and when the idea of peace seemed almost laughable. But somewhere along the long, tangled path of history, something changed. Not all at once, not in a single decision or decree. It happened quietly, like a habit forming. In the beginning, the people did not notice it. A merchant named Theodoros closed his stall near the Forum of Constantine, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. His hands smelled of spices, cinnamon, pepper, dried citrus peel brought from distant lands. Trade had become steady again, predictable. That was new. He remembered the old days when caravans would arrive late, or not at all, when rumors of raids would travel faster than goods. Now, ships came and went with quiet regularity. He did not think of it as survival. He simply thought, the roads are safe. But safety, in a world like theirs, was not an accident. In the imperial palace, where marble floors reflected torchlight like still water, the emperor sat with a handful of advisors. There were no raised voices, no sweeping gestures, just measured discussion, careful phrasing, and long pauses between words. These meetings had become the true engine of the empire, not battles, not sieges, but conversations. One advisor, an older man with tired eyes, spoke softly. "We cannot outfight them all," he said, "but we do not need to. We only need them to fight each other or to wait." Waiting had become a strategy. To the north, rival tribes argued over borders. To the east, powerful kingdoms exhausted themselves in long campaigns. And the Byzantines, they watched. They wrote letters. They sent gifts. They arranged marriages. They delayed decisions just long enough for circumstances to shift. Time itself became their ally. A young scribe named Anna worked late into the evening, copying letters that would be sent across the known world. Her fingers moved quickly, but her mind wandered. Each letter was polite, respectful, almost gentle in tone. There were no threats, no bold declarations, just subtle suggestions, carefully chosen compliments, and offers that could be accepted or ignored without offense. She wondered if anyone realized how powerful these words were, because each letter was a thread, and together they formed a web, one that stretched far beyond the city's walls. a web of relationships, obligations, and quiet understandings. No single thread held much strength on its own, but together they made something surprisingly resilient. The empire was no longer trying to dominate. It was learning to endure. Outside the palace, life continued in its slow, familiar patterns. Bakers rose before dawn. Fishermen pushed their boats into dark water. Children played in narrow streets, their laughter echoing against stone walls that had stood for generations. There was no grand announcement that peace had arrived. It simply settled. Not perfect peace, not the kind sung about in heroic tales. There were still disputes, still moments of tension, still whispers of distant conflicts. But within the heart of the empire, there was a growing sense that collapse was no longer inevitable. A soldier named Marcus leaned against the inner gate, his armor resting more loosely than it once had. He still trained, still kept watch, but the urgency had faded. His duties had shifted from constant readiness to quiet vigilance. He did not feel weaker. In fact, he felt something closer to relief. The empire had discovered something unexpected, that strength did not always require action. Sometimes it required restraint. Sometimes the greatest victory was simply avoiding a fight that did not need to happen. And so the years passed, not in dramatic leaps, but in small, steady steps. Trade expanded slowly, connecting the city to lands that had once been hostile or unreachable. Diplomats traveled more frequently than generals. Gold coins moved more often than armies, and with each exchange, each agreement, each compromise, the empire wove itself more tightly into the fabric of the world around it. It became, in a quiet way, indispensable. Neighbors who might once have attacked now hesitated, not out of fear, but out of calculation. War would disrupt trade. It would close routes. It would break agreements that had become useful. And usefulness can be more powerful than fear. In a modest home near the city's edge, an elderly woman named Eleni sat by a window, watching the street below. She had lived long enough to remember the chaos of earlier years, the sudden alarms, the hurried evacuations, the uncertainty that lingered like a shadow. Now she watched her grandchildren play without worry. She did not know about the letters, or the negotiations, or the careful balancing of distant powers. She only knew that life had become calmer, and that was enough. The empire, once defined by its struggles, was slowly redefining itself through something far less visible. It was learning to bend without breaking, to adapt without losing its identity, to survive not through dominance, but through understanding. Of course, not everyone approved. There were voices, quiet at first, but growing, who believed the empire had become too soft, that it had forgotten its strength. That peace, this fragile, negotiated peace, was nothing more than a pause before inevitable decline. They whispered in corners, in taverns, in private gatherings, An empire should not wait, they said. It should act. But action, as the emperor understood, came in many forms. Sometimes, action was a decision not to act at all. As the city drifted into night, lanterns flickering one by one, the sense of quiet persistence deepened. This was not the story of a sudden transformation. It was the story of accumulation of small choices, repeated over time, shaping something larger than any single moment. The Byzantine Empire was not surviving because it had become invincible. It was surviving because it had become careful, and careful things can last a very long time. In the days that followed, the rhythms of the city continued, almost unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, subtle shifts were always in motion. A treaty renewed here, a disagreement gently redirected there, a potential conflict softened before it could fully form. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth recording in grand chronicles. And yet, these small moments were quietly reshaping the future. Far beyond the city, in lands where the empire's influence reached only through whispers and trade routes, the same pattern began to emerge. Leaders who once viewed Byzantium as a rival now saw it as a partner, or at least as something too interconnected to disturb lightly. It was not love, but it was stability, and stability in a world built on uncertainty was a rare and valuable thing. Back in Constantinople, Theodoros opened his stall again at dawn. The market filled slowly, voices rising in a familiar chorus. He arranged his goods with practiced hands, barely thinking about the wider world. He did not know that he was living in a carefully maintained balance. He only knew that customers would come. That was enough. And as the sun rose over the city, casting long shadows across ancient stone, the Byzantine Empire continued its quiet experiment. An empire choosing patience over pride, endurance over expansion, and peace, not as an ideal, but as a strategy that for now was working. But as with all delicate balances, the question lingered unspoken, but always present. How long could it last? Because even the most careful systems carry within them the seeds of change. And somewhere, beyond the edges of this quiet stability, forces were already beginning to shift. The shift did not arrive with thunder or fire. It came quietly, as most changes in the empire now did, subtle enough that only those who were trained to notice could feel it at first. In a dim chamber near the palace archives, Anna paused as she read a newly arrived letter. The parchment was smooth, the handwriting elegant, but something in its tone felt different. Not hostile, not even unfriendly, just slightly less certain. The kind of uncertainty that could grow if left unattended. She read it again, slower this time. The sender, a distant ruler who had long maintained a comfortable relationship with the empire, was asking for a delay. Not refusing an agreement, not breaking a promise, simply postponing. Anna set the letter aside carefully. Delays were not unusual. In fact, the Byzantines themselves had perfected the art of delay. But when others began to use the same tactic, it created a strange kind of mirror, one that reflected the empire's own strategies back at it. And mirrors, she knew, could be dangerous. Elsewhere in the city, Theodoros noticed something small but unusual. A shipment that should have arrived at dawn was missing. Not late, missing entirely. The harbor workers shrugged when he asked. "It will come tomorrow," one of them said, though his voice carried less confidence than usual. Theodoros nodded, but as he returned to his stall, a faint unease followed him. For years, consistency had been the foundation of everything. Trade routes, schedules, expectations. If even one part of that system began to shift, it could ripple outward in ways that were difficult to predict. Still, he told himself, one missing shipment meant nothing. Probably, at the palace, the emperor listened as his advisors spoke in measured tones. The letter Anna had read now lay open on the table between them. "It is not a refusal," one advisor said, "but it is not acceptance either." The emperor nodded slowly. "It is hesitation, and hesitation," another added, "can spread." There was no panic in the room, no sense of urgency, just the familiar, careful consideration that had come to define the empire's way of thinking. Yet, beneath that calm surface, something else stirred, a recognition that the balance they had built was not fixed. It required constant attention. "We respond," the emperor said at last, "but not with pressure." Then with what? He considered the question for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the city stretched out beneath the fading light. With reassurance, the word settled into the room like a soft weight. Reassurance was not a show of strength. It was not a demand or a warning. It was something quieter, an attempt to restore confidence without forcing a decision. A reminder that the relationship still held value, and value, more than anything, was what kept the empire's web intact. Anna returned to her desk, dipping her pen into ink as she began drafting the reply. Her movements were steady, but her thoughts lingered on the subtle change she had sensed. For so long, the empire had guided the rhythm of these exchanges. Now, the rhythm seemed slightly uneven, not broken, but no longer entirely predictable. Outside, the city moved through its usual patterns, though small disruptions began to appear. A merchant argued more loudly than necessary over a price. A fisherman returned early, his nets lighter than expected. A group of travelers lingered at the gates longer than usual, waiting for confirmation that it was safe to proceed. Each moment on its own seemed insignificant. Together, they formed something harder to ignore. Marcus, standing once again at his post near the inner gate, noticed the change in posture among the guards. It was subtle, slightly straighter backs, sharper glances toward the horizon. No one spoke of it directly, but the shift was there. Not fear, just awareness. He adjusted his grip on his spear, not because he expected trouble, but because something in the air suggested that vigilance might soon become more important again. Still, there were no alarms, no sudden movements. The Empire did not react quickly. It never had. It absorbed change, studied it, and responded with deliberate care. That was its strength, but it could also be its weakness. In a quiet courtyard, Eleni watched as her grandchildren played their usual games. Their laughter echoed against the stone walls, unchanged and carefree. For them, nothing had shifted. The world was still safe, still stable, still predictable. Eleni smiled faintly. She had lived long enough to recognize the early signs of change, even when others could not. It was not something she could explain, just a feeling, like a distant storm that had not yet reached the shore. She did not speak of it. Some things she had learned were better observed than announced. Back in the palace, the emperor received another report. This one spoke of tensions between two neighboring powers. Nothing new, nothing unusual. But the tone suggested that the situation might resolve faster than expected. That could be good for us, one advisor said. Or not, another replied. If those powers reached peace on their own terms, they might no longer rely on Byzantine mediation. They might no longer need the careful balance the empire provided. And if they did not need it, the thought remained unfinished. The emperor leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than concerned. We do not control outcomes, he said. We influence them. It was a distinction he had come to understand deeply. The empire did not force the world into shape. It nudged it gently, patiently, over time. But nudging required resistance. Without it, there was nothing to guide. Anna sealed the letter she had written, pressing the wax with steady hands. As she handed it off to be delivered, she felt a quiet sense of responsibility. Each word she wrote carried weight, even if that weight was invisible, especially if it was invisible. Days passed. The missing shipment finally arrived, though smaller than expected. The harbor workers offered no clear explanation, only vague reassurances. Theodoros accepted it, adjusting his expectations without complaint. That, too, had become part of the empire's way, adaptation, without resistance. But inside, he kept count, not of goods, but of patterns, because patterns, once broken, rarely returned in exactly the same form. Marcus noticed that patrol routes were being reviewed more frequently, not expanded, not intensified, just reconsidered. It was the kind of change that suggested preparation rather than reaction. He appreciated that. Preparation meant there was still time. Time, after all, had always been the empire's greatest ally. Yet time could also belong to others, far beyond the city, in places where Byzantine influence was once unquestioned. new ideas were beginning to take shape. Leaders who had long accepted the empire's quiet guidance started to imagine alternatives. Not rebellion, not opposition, just independence. It was not a sudden shift. It was a slow one, the kind that could go unnoticed, until it was already too late to reverse. Back in Constantinople, the nights remained calm. The lamps still flickered. The sea still whispered against the walls. To an outsider, nothing had changed. But within the careful systems that held everything together, tension was beginning to build. Not enough to break anything. Not yet. The emperor stood alone for a moment on a balcony overlooking the city. The lights below stretched out in soft patterns, familiar and reassuring. He had spent years maintaining this balance, shaping it, protecting it. He knew it could not last forever. No system could. But the question was not whether it would change. The question was how. Would the empire adapt again, as it had so many times before? Or would this shift, quiet, gradual, almost invisible, become something more difficult to manage? He exhaled slowly, the cool night air steady against his skin. For now, there was no need for drastic action, only attention, only care, only the same patient approach that had carried the empire this far. Behind him, in the halls of the palace, scribes continued to write, advisors continued to speak, and decisions continued to be made, not quickly, not loudly, but with the same deliberate rhythm that defined everything they did. And in the city below, life went on, calm, measured, unaware, but somewhere, just beyond that calm surface, the balance was shifting. And this time, the empire would need to decide whether patience alone would be enough. The change did not announce itself, but it deepened. By the time the next week settled over Constantinople, the small irregularities that once felt isolated had begun to align into something more noticeable, still quiet, still controlled, but no longer easily dismissed as coincidence. Anna felt it first in the silence between letters, where once replies came with a steady rhythm. Now there were gaps. Not long enough to cause alarm, but long enough to be felt. A day here, 2 days there, just enough to interrupt the smooth flow of communication that had sustained the empire's delicate web. She sat at her desk, surrounded by neatly stacked scrolls, her fingers resting lightly on a piece of parchment that remained unanswered. It was not urgent. It did not demand immediate attention. And yet, its stillness seemed louder than any reply. For the Byzantines, silence had always been a tool. Now, others were learning how to use it too. In the marketplace, Theodoros adjusted his stall once again. The missing shipment from before had been followed by another delay, this time explained as weather troubles somewhere far beyond the sea. He nodded politely when told, but the explanation felt thinner than it should have. Customers still came, though their questions lingered a little longer than before. Will the prices rise? One asked. Only slightly, Theodoros replied, though he was no longer certain. It was not fear that spread through the market, but curiosity. A subtle shift from confidence to cautious observation. People were beginning to notice the patterns changing, even if they could not yet understand why. Marcus, standing near the outer wall this time, watched a group of travelers approach the gates. Their clothing marked them as merchants, their carts filled with goods that would once have passed through quickly. Today they were stopped, not for long, just long enough for questions to be asked, for documents to be checked more carefully than usual. Marcus did not intervene. He simply observed. Procedure had not changed, but its application had become sharper. Inside the palace, the emperor listened to a different kind of report. Not about delayed letters or missing shipments, but about shifting loyalties. Nothing confirmed, the advisor said. Only indications. Indications are enough, the emperor replied. He had learned long ago that certainty often arrived too late to be useful. It was the subtle signs, the almost invisible adjustments, that mattered most. And what do these indications suggest? He asked. The advisor hesitated briefly, choosing his words with care. That some of our partners are beginning to explore options. The word options hung in the air. Not rebellion, not betrayal, just the possibility of alternatives. The emperor nodded slowly. It was not unexpected. In fact, it was inevitable. The empire's strength had always depended on being necessary. If others began to believe they could function without it, the balance would shift. The question was not how to stop this change. It was how to respond to it. Do we intervene? Another advisor asked. The emperor shook his head. Not yet. Intervention, he knew, could disrupt more than it repaired. The empire's power came from subtlety, from guiding rather than forcing. If they acted too quickly, they risked breaking the very system they were trying to preserve. But waiting carried its own risks. Anna finally received a reply to the letter she had sent days earlier. She read it carefully, her expression unreadable. The tone was polite, as always, respectful, even warm. But something was missing. Commitment. Where there should have been a clear agreement, there was now a suggestion of future discussion. A promise to revisit the matter later. A delay wrapped in courtesy. She placed the letter down gently. The web was not breaking, but it was loosening. In a quiet corner of the city, Eleni listened as two neighbors spoke in hushed tones. They were not discussing politics or distant rulers. They were talking about something simpler, uncertainty. Have you noticed? One asked. Eleni said nothing, but she nodded slightly. It was enough. The uncertainty had not yet taken shape, but it had begun to spread. Not as panic, but as awareness. A subtle recognition that something was shifting beneath the surface of their stable world. Children still played in the streets. The markets still opened each morning. The lamps still burned each night, but the feeling had changed, and feelings, Eleni knew, often changed before reality did. Back at the harbor, Theodoros watched as another ship arrived, smaller than expected, its crew quieter than usual. Goods were unloaded without the usual energy, the usual rhythm. Everything felt slower. He approached one of the sailors. "Long journey?" he asked. The man nodded. "Longer than it should have been." Theodoros considered asking more, but decided against it. Answers, he had learned, were not always given directly. Sometimes they revealed themselves over time. Time, it had always been the Empire's greatest strength. But now, time seemed to belong to others as well. Marcus noticed that more guards had been assigned to positions that once required fewer. Not enough to suggest danger, just enough to suggest preparation. He did not question it. He simply adjusted. That was what the Empire did best, adjust. In the palace, the Emperor stood before a large map, its surface marked with faint lines and symbols representing relationships rather than territories. This was not a map of land. It was a map of influence. Some lines remained strong, clearly defined. Others had begun to fade, their connections less certain than before. He traced one of the fading lines with his finger. "Not broken," he murmured, "just weaker." An advisor stepped forward. "We can reinforce it." "How?" the emperor asked. "With incentives, trade advantages, renewed agreements." The emperor considered this. It was the obvious approach, the familiar one. But familiarity, he knew, could become a weakness if relied upon too heavily. "If we offer more," he said slowly, "we teach them to expect more." The advisor did not respond. Because it was true. The empire had built its survival on balance, on giving just enough, taking just enough, and maintaining equilibrium. If that balance shifted too far in one direction, it could become unsustainable. Anna returned to her work, but her thoughts lingered on the letters she had read. Each one, on its own, seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. The empire was not losing control, but it was losing certainty. And certainty, she realized, had been an invisible foundation beneath everything they had built. Without it, even the strongest systems could begin to feel unstable. Eleni sat by her window once more, watching the evening settle over the city. The familiar sounds returned, the distant chatter, the soft footsteps, the occasional laughter. It all seemed the same, but it was not. She could feel it in the stillness between those sounds. A quiet tension that had not been there before, not enough to disturb sleep. Not yet, but enough to be noticed. The emperor finally turned away from the map, his expression calm but thoughtful. He had faced crises before, louder, clearer, more immediate. This was different. This was slower, and in some ways more difficult, because it required patience, not just as a strategy, but but as a test. Could the empire remain patient, even as the world around it began to change? Or would it be forced to act in ways that risked everything it had built? He did not have the answer. Not yet, but he understood one thing clearly. The balance was no longer something they could simply maintain. It was something they would have to reshape. And reshaping, even for an empire as careful as theirs, was never without risk. As night settled fully over Constantinople, the city remained calm, its light steady, its rhythms intact. To anyone watching from afar, it would have seemed unchanged. But within its walls, within its systems, within the quiet decisions being made behind closed doors, something important was unfolding. The Byzantine Empire was entering a new phase of its survival, not one defined by stability alone, but by adaptation under pressure. And this time, patience might not be enough on its own. The realization came slowly, not as a moment of clarity, but as a gradual acceptance that the rules which had sustained the empire were beginning to bend in unfamiliar ways. By the following days, Constantinople still appeared unchanged to the casual observer. The great walls stood unmoved, the domes still caught the golden light of morning, and the narrow streets echoed with the same routines. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, decisions were becoming more deliberate, more cautious. Each one weighed not just for its immediate effect, but for how it might ripple outward into an increasingly uncertain world. Anna noticed it in the way her instructions began to shift. Where once she had been told to maintain tone, now she was told to adjust it. Some letters required more warmth than before. Others needed a trace of firmness, nothing overt, nothing that could be called pressure, but enough to remind distant rulers that the empire still carried quiet authority. It was a delicate change. Too much warmth could be mistaken for weakness. Too much firmness could disrupt the careful balance they had spent years building. She dipped her pen into ink, hesitating slightly before beginning a new letter. The words came as they always did, measured, precise, intentional. But now each sentence carried an added weight. Not just communication, but calibration. Across the city, Theodoros found himself doing something similar, though in a different way. He began adjusting his prices, not drastically, just enough to account for the small inconsistencies that had begun to creep into trade. A little higher here, a little more cautious there. Customers noticed, not with alarm, but with quiet curiosity. "Things are changing," one of them remarked. Theodoros gave a small shrug. "They always do." It was a simple answer, but it carried a truth that had become increasingly important. Change was not the problem. Uncontrolled change was. At the gates, Marcus received new instructions. Patrols were to remain the same in number, but their routes would vary slightly from day to day. Not predictable, not fixed, flexible. He understood the reasoning immediately. Predictability, once a strength, could now become a vulnerability. If others were watching, and they always were, then shifting patterns would make it harder to anticipate the empire's movements. Still, the change felt subtle enough that most citizens would never notice. And that, Marcus thought, was the point. In the palace, the emperor sat once again with his advisors, but the tone of their discussions had evolved. There was still calm, still patience, but now there was also a quiet urgency, not the kind that demanded immediate action, but the kind that encouraged readiness. "We are not losing control," one advisor said carefully. "No," the emperor replied, "but we are no longer setting the pace." That distinction mattered. For years, the empire had guided events through timing, delaying when necessary, accelerating when beneficial, always maintaining a sense of quiet control over the flow of interactions. Now, that control was becoming shared. Others were beginning to act on their own timelines, making decisions without waiting for Byzantine influence to shape them. It was not defiance. It was independence. And independence was far more difficult to manage than opposition. "Then we adapt," another advisor suggested. "We always have," the emperor said. But adaptation, he knew, required more than adjustment. It required understanding the nature of the change itself. And this change was not about power. It was about perception. Far beyond the city, rulers who had once relied on the empire's stability were beginning to see alternatives, not necessarily better ones, but different ones. And in a world of shifting possibilities, difference alone could be enough to alter decisions. Anna finished another letter and set it aside, her mind tracing the subtle evolution of the empire's voice. It was no longer just maintaining relationships. It was reinforcing them, strengthening the threads that had begun to loosen. But threads, once stretched, did not always return to their original tension. In a shaded courtyard, Eleni watched as her grandchildren argued briefly over a game before quickly resolving it among themselves. She smiled faintly at the simplicity of it. Children adapted easily. They did not cling to fixed patterns. They adjusted, negotiated, moved forward without hesitation. Empires, she thought, were not so different, but they often forgot how to adapt without fear. The harbor remained active, though its rhythm had changed. Ships still arrived, goods still moved, but the flow felt less certain, less predictable. Theodoros found himself asking more questions than before, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity. Information, he realized, was becoming as valuable as the goods themselves. Marcus noticed that some travelers now carried additional documents, proofs of agreement, confirmations of safe passage, small assurances that had not been required before. It was not a sign of distrust. It was a sign of caution, and caution, once introduced, tended to spread. In the palace, the emperor stood once again before the map of influence. This time, he did not focus on the fatting lines. Instead, he looked for the ones that remained strong. These, he said quietly, gesturing to a cluster of connections that still held firm. We protect. An advisor nodded, and the others. We support, the emperor replied, but we do not chase. It was a subtle shift in strategy. Before, the empire had maintained all connections with equal care, ensuring that the entire web remained balanced. Now it would prioritize, strengthening what remained reliable, while allowing weaker connections to either stabilize or fade on their own. It was not abandonment. It was refinement. Anna received a reply that surprised her, not because of its content, but because of its tone. It was clearer than the others, more decisive. An agreement confirmed without delay. She read it twice, then allowed herself a small, quiet breath. Not all threads were weakening. Some were holding, and those that held could become anchors. Eleni closed her window as night settled in, the cool air carrying familiar sounds through the streets. The city still felt safe, still felt stable, but she knew now that stability was not something that simply existed. It was something that had to be maintained. Constantly, carefully, the emperor returned to his seat, the weight of quiet decisions settling around him. He had chosen patience once, and it had preserved the empire. Now he was choosing something slightly different, not abandoning patience, but guiding it, shaping it into something more active, more responsive, because the world had changed, and the empire, if it wished to survive, would need to change with it. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but deliberately. Outside, Constantinople remained, as it always had, calm, measured, enduring. Its people moved through their lives with quiet confidence, unaware of the careful adjustments unfolding behind the scenes. But those adjustments were beginning to take shape. Small shifts in tone, subtle changes in movement, quiet decisions that would, over time, redefine the balance the empire had relied upon for so long. And this time, survival would not come from patience alone. It would come from knowing when to hold steady and when to move, because even the most peaceful empire could not remain still forever. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the next test was already beginning to form, slowly, quietly, and with the same subtlety that had brought them to this moment. The question was no longer whether the Byzantine Empire could survive peacefully. It was whether it could evolve without losing the very calm that had made its survival possible. And as the night deepened, that question lingered unanswered, but no longer distant. It was approaching, one careful step at a time. Morning arrived without announcement, as it always did, spreading slowly across the rooftops of Constantinople and touching the domes with a pale, golden light. From a distance, nothing seemed altered. The city still held its shape, its quiet confidence, its familiar rhythm. But within that rhythm, something new had begun to settle, not disruption, not instability, but a kind of awareness that had not been there before. It was no longer enough for the empire to simply endure. Now it had to choose how to endure. Anna felt this shift more clearly than most. The stack of correspondence on her desk had grown, but it was not the number that caught her attention. It was the variety. Messages that once followed predictable patterns now carried subtle differences. Some were more direct, others more cautious. A few even hinted at urgency, though never openly. She began to categorize them, not by origin, but by tone. Confident, uncertain, testing. The last category was new. There were rulers, it seemed, who were no longer simply responding to the empire's influence. They were probing it, sending messages not just to communicate, but to observe how the Byzantines would react, how quickly they would reply, how firmly they would respond, how much they were willing to offer. It was a quiet kind of challenge, and it required a careful answer. She selected one such letter and began to draft a reply. Not too fast, not too slow, not too warm, not too distant. Each word was placed with intention, like a stone in a structure that had to remain perfectly balanced. Across the city, Theodoros had started keeping records, small marks on a wax tablet, noting the arrival times of ships, the quantities of goods, the fluctuations in prices. He had never needed to do this before. Trade had once been reliable enough to trust without question. Now, trust required verification. He did not resent it. In fact, there was something almost comforting in the act of tracking, of understanding patterns as they formed and shifted. It gave him a sense of control, however small, in a world that was becoming slightly less predictable. At the gates, Marcus noticed a different kind of traveler, envoys. They arrived with modest escorts, carrying sealed documents and carefully measured expressions. They were not unusual, but their frequency had increased, and more importantly, their behavior had changed. They observed more, spoke less, listened carefully to every answer given. Marcus watched them pass, his instincts sharpening not from fear, but from recognition. These were not messengers simply delivering words. They were gathering impressions. Inside the palace, the emperor received one of these envoys in a quiet chamber, far from the grand halls. The meeting was simple, no elaborate ceremony, no display of power, just conversation. The envoy spoke politely, asking questions that seemed harmless on the surface. Trade routes, security, stability. The emperor answered in the same tone, offering information without revealing too much. It was a delicate exchange, one built not on what was said, but on what was left unsaid. When the envoy departed, one of the advisors stepped forward. "He is measuring us," the advisor said. "Yes," the emperor replied, "as we measure them." This, he understood, was the next stage. Not conflict, not even competition, but observation, each side watching the other, adjusting, learning, preparing not for war, but for positioning within a changing world. Anna received reports of these meetings and adjusted her writing accordingly. Where once she might have assumed goodwill, she now accounted for scrutiny. Each letter became both a message and a signal, something that would be read not just for its content, but for its tone, its timing, its intent. She found herself thinking less like a scribe and more like a strategist. Eleni, sitting by her window once again, noticed the increase in visitors passing through her street. Not locals, not traders, but outsiders, people who carried themselves differently, who looked at the city not as a home, but as something to be understood. She watched them quietly, her expression thoughtful. The city had always been a place of movement, of exchange. But this felt different, more deliberate, as if Constantinople itself had become something to study. At the harbor, Theodoros spoke with a sailor who had returned from a distant port. "They are building new agreements," the sailor said casually. "Without us?" Theodoros asked. The sailor shrugged. "Not against you, just without needing you." Theodoros nodded slowly. It was a small distinction, but an important one. The empire was not being rejected. It was simply no longer essential in every exchange. And that, more than anything, was the true shift taking place. Marcus received another adjustment to his orders, this time a slight increase in communication between gate posts. Nothing dramatic, just more frequent updates, more shared observations. Information, it seemed, was becoming the empire's most valuable resource. Not gold, not land, but awareness. In the palace, the emperor gathered his advisors once more. The map before them had not changed physically, but its meaning had. "We are no longer at the center of every decision," one advisor said. "No," the emperor agreed, "but we are still part of them. And if that changes..." The emperor was silent for a moment. "Then we ensure," he said slowly, "that our presence is still beneficial." It was not about control. It was about relevance. The empire had survived by becoming necessary. Now, it would survive by remaining valuable, even in a world that no longer depended on it as completely as before. Anna drafted a new series of letters, not in response to specific messages, but as a proactive gesture. Invitations, offers, small opportunities for cooperation that reminded distant rulers of the advantages of connection. Not demands, not pressure, just possibilities. She understood now that influence was not something that could be assumed. It had to be maintained. Eleni closed her eyes briefly, listening to the city as evening settled once more. The sounds were still familiar, but layered now with something new, a quiet tension, yes, but also a sense of movement, of transition. The empire was not weakening. It was changing, and change, she knew, was neither good nor bad. It simply was. Theodoros reviewed his records at the end of the day. noticing patterns that were beginning to stabilize again, though not in the same way as before. The rhythms were different now, but they were forming. New routes, new timings, new expectations. He smiled faintly. Perhaps stability was not about returning to what had been. Perhaps it was about adapting to what was becoming. Marcus stood at his post as night fell, the cool air steady against his face. He felt no fear, no urgency, just a heightened sense of awareness, a readiness that came not from danger, but from understanding. The empire was not under attack, but it was being tested, not by force, but by change. In the palace, the emperor looked out over the city once more, his expression calm but focused. He had guided the empire through uncertainty before, but this was different. This was not a storm to be endured. It was a current to be navigated, and navigation required more than patience. It required direction, careful, deliberate direction. The lights of Constantinople flickered gently in the darkness, unchanged to those who lived within its walls. But beyond those walls, the world was shifting, quietly, steadily, and with a momentum that could not be ignored. The Byzantine Empire had entered a new phase of its existence, not one of decline, not one of dominance, but one of adaptation in a world that was learning to move without it. And now, more than ever, its survival would depend on something deeper than patience. It would depend on understanding when to guide and when to follow, because even the most enduring empires must, at times, step back in order to remain part of what comes next. The next phase did not begin with a decision, but with a realization that settled quietly across the empire's inner circles. For years, the Byzantines had shaped the flow of events through subtle influence, guiding outcomes without forcing them, maintaining balance without drawing attention. But now, the current of the world had grown broader, more complex, and less responsive to a single guiding hand. The empire was no longer the quiet center. It was becoming something else. Anna understood this first not through instruction, but through absence. There were fewer direct requests arriving at her desk, fewer moments where distant rulers sought Byzantine mediation or approval. Instead, she began to see copies of agreements already made, decisions already taken, outcomes already decided. They still informed the empire, but they did not wait for it. She traced the lines of one such document with her fingers, her expression calm but thoughtful. The tone was respectful, even appreciative, but it carried a subtle message beneath its words. We value your presence. We no longer depend on it. It was not rejection. It was evolution. At the harbor, Theodoros noticed something similar. Ships still arrived. Goods still moved. But the patterns had shifted in a way that no longer revolved around Constantinople as strongly as before. Some routes bypassed the city entirely, connecting distant ports directly. He did not take offense. Trade, like water, followed the easiest path, and the paths were changing. Still, the city remained important, just not essential in every exchange. And that difference, though small in appearance, carried deep implications. Marcus, stationed along a quieter stretch of the wall, observed fewer large caravans entering at once. Instead, smaller groups arrived more frequently, carrying less, but moving faster. It was a change in scale, not in purpose. Movement had become more flexible, less centralized. He adjusted his watch accordingly, noting that vigilance now required attention to many small movements rather than a few large ones. Inside the palace, the emperor gathered his advisors once again, but this time the conversation took on a different tone. There was no longer a question of whether things were changing. They had changed. The world has grown accustomed to stability, one advisor said, and now it is learning to create its own. The emperor nodded. That was always the risk, he replied. By offering stability for so long, the empire had inadvertently taught others how to achieve it themselves. What had once been a unique strength had become a shared skill. And so, another advisor asked, "What do we become now?" The question lingered in the air. Not a challenge, not a crisis, but a turning point. The emperor did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly to the map that had guided so many of their discussions. This time, he did not focus on connections or influence. He looked at space, at the gaps between lines, at the areas where the empire was not present. "We become selective," he said at last. The word carried weight, no longer maintaining every connection, no longer guiding every interaction. Instead, choosing carefully where to invest attention, where to build deeper ties, where to remain quietly involved, and where to step back entirely. It was not retreat. It was refinement. Anna received new instructions that reflected this shift. Some correspondences were to be given priority, answered quickly, with care and detail. Others were to be acknowledged more simply, with polite brevity, and some were to be left unanswered for a time, not ignored, but allowed to exist without immediate engagement. It was a subtle but powerful change. Silence, once used cautiously, was now becoming a deliberate tool once more, but in a different way than before, not to delay outcomes, but to observe reactions. Eleni, watching the city from her window, noticed that the flow of strangers had become less concentrated. They still came, still passed through, but without the same intensity. The city felt steadier again, though in a quieter, less central way. She folded her hands in her lap, her expression thoughtful. Perhaps, she considered, the empire was learning something new, not how to hold everything together, but how to remain whole, even as the world around it spread outward. At the harbor, Theodoros adjusted his expectations once more. He no longer waited for every shipment to pass through Constantinople. Instead, he began forming smaller agreements, local arrangements that ensured his business remained steady regardless of larger changes. He was no longer relying on the empire's central position. He was adapting alongside it. Marcus noticed that his orders had shifted again, not toward increased defense, but toward awareness beyond the walls. Reports from nearby regions were shared more frequently. Information flowed inward, not just outward. The empire was listening more and speaking less. In the palace, the emperor sat in quiet reflection after the advisors had departed. The path ahead was not uncertain. It was simply different from what had come before. The empire would no longer define the world around it, but it could still shape its place within that world. And sometimes that was enough. Anna wrote a letter, unlike the others she had composed in years. It did not guide, did not suggest, did not subtly influence. It simply acknowledged a recognition of another ruler's decision, offered with respect and without expectation. When she finished, she paused. It felt different, lighter, as if the empire had released something it had been holding for a long time. Eleni listened to the evening sounds once more, but this time, the quiet tension that had lingered before seemed to soften. Not disappear, but settle into something more stable. Change had arrived, and the city had absorbed it. Theodoros closed his stall at the end of the day, reviewing his records with a small, satisfied nod. The patterns were different now, but they were consistent again. Not the same consistency as before, but a new one. Marcus stood beneath the night sky, his posture relaxed but attentive. He no longer felt the subtle tightening that had marked the earlier days of uncertainty. Instead, there was a sense of balance returning, not imposed, but discovered. And in the palace, the emperor looked out over Constantinople one more time, the lights below steady and calm. The empire had not lost its way. It had changed direction. Peace, he realized, had never been about controlling everything. It had been about understanding what needed to be held and what needed to be let go. Beyond the walls, the world continued to shift, to grow, to evolve in ways the empire could not fully direct. But within those changes, the Byzantine Empire remained, not at the center of all things, but still present, still steady, still quietly enduring. And perhaps, in the end, that was the true secret of its survival, not dominance, not control, but the ability to remain even as everything else moved on. As the night deepened and the city settled into its familiar rhythm, one truth became clear. The empire had not just survived peacefully, it had learned how to exist within peace without needing to define it. And that understanding would carry it forward into whatever came next. The quiet transformation did not end with acceptance. In many ways, that was only the beginning. By the time another stretch of days passed over Constantinople, the empire had settled into its new rhythm, less central, more selective, and quietly aware of its place in a world that no longer revolved around it. But with that shift came a new kind of challenge, one that was less visible than the changes before it. It was not about losing influence. It was about maintaining identity. Anna felt it as she reviewed a growing number of correspondences that no longer required careful persuasion. Many letters now carried simple acknowledgments, confirmations, or shared updates. They were polite, stable, even reassuring, but they lacked something that had once defined them: depth, where once each message had been an opportunity to shape events. Now many were merely records of events already shaped elsewhere. The empire was still included, but not always involved. She placed one such letter aside, her fingers resting on the edge of the parchment. If the empire no longer guided every outcome, what defined its role? The question lingered, not as a concern, but as something waiting to be understood. In the marketplace, Theodoros noticed that conversations had shifted. Traders spoke less about distant uncertainty and more about local opportunities. Smaller ventures, new partnerships, quieter expansions. The great, sweeping trade routes still existed, but they were no longer the only paths that mattered. Things feel closer now, one merchant remarked. Theodoros nodded. Yes, closer, less dependent on a single center, more distributed. It was not a loss. It was a redistribution of importance. Marcus observed something similar at the gates. The steady flow of travelers continued, but their purpose had changed. Fewer came seeking permission or protection. More arrived with their own plans already in motion. They passed through the city not as participants in a larger system, but as individuals moving along their own paths. It required a different kind of awareness, less oversight, more observation. Inside the palace, the emperor convened his advisors once again. Though the atmosphere had shifted from reaction to reflection. We have adapted, one advisor said. Yes, the emperor replied, but adaptation is not the end. He stood slowly, moving toward the map that had once represented influence, then transformation. Now, it represented something else entirely. Continuity. We must decide what remains unchanged, he said. The room grew still. For an empire that had survived through careful adjustment, the idea of preserving something fixed carried a different kind of weight. What cannot be altered, the emperor continued. What defines us, regardless of the world around us? The advisors exchanged quiet glances. It was not a question of strategy. It was a question of identity. Anna received new instructions that surprised her, not because they were complex, but because they were simple. Write clearly, the directive stated. Not carefully, not strategically, clearly. It was a subtle but profound shift. The empire was no longer trying to shape every interaction. Instead, it was focusing on being understood, presenting itself without layers of influence, without the quiet manipulations that had once defined its strength. Clarity, she realized, was a different kind of power. It required confidence. At the harbor, Theodoros noticed that negotiations had become more direct. Prices were discussed openly. Agreements were made without the same intricate balancing of expectations. There was less maneuvering, more honesty. It was not always easier, but it was simpler, and simplicity had its own kind of stability. Eleni, watching from her window, sensed the change not in actions, but in atmosphere. The subtle tension that had once filled the air had softened, replaced by something steadier. Acceptance, not resignation, but a quiet understanding that the world had changed, and the city had changed with it. She closed her eyes briefly, listening. The sounds were the same, but the feeling behind them had shifted. Marcus received a final adjustment to his orders, one that seemed almost insignificant. Trust your judgment. No detailed instructions. No specific patterns to follow. Just trust. It was a sign that the empire no longer relied solely on structured systems. It was beginning to trust the individuals within it to interpret, to respond, to act when necessary. Control was being replaced with confidence. In the palace, the emperor sat alone once more, the weight of years of careful decisions resting quietly around him. He had guided the empire through uncertainty, through adaptation, through transformation. Now he faced something different. Definition. What did it mean to be the Byzantine Empire in a world that no longer depended on it as before? He did not seek a grand answer. He did not need one, because the truth, he realized, was already present in the quiet persistence of the city itself, in the steady rhythm of its people, in the continuity of its traditions, in the calm way it had absorbed change without losing itself. Anna wrote another letter, this one unlike any she had composed before. It did not seek to influence. It did not anticipate response. It simply expressed a statement of presence, a reflection of stability. When she finished, she felt a quiet sense of completion, not because the letter would change anything, but because it did not need to. Eleni watched as her grandchildren played once more, their laughter unchanged by the shifting world beyond their understanding. She smiled, recognizing in their simplicity something the empire had rediscovered. Not everything needed to be controlled. Some things simply needed to continue. Theodoros closed his stall as evening approached, his records now steady, his expectations aligned with the new patterns that had formed. He no longer compared them to the past. He accepted them as the present. Marcus stood beneath the fading light, his posture relaxed but aware. He no longer watched for signs of disruption. He watched for continuity. And in the palace, the emperor rose from his seat, stepping toward the balcony for what had become a familiar moment of reflection. The city stretched out before him, unchanged in its essence, even as everything around it had shifted. The Byzantine Empire had not held the world in place. It had allowed the world to move and learned how to move within it. Peace had not been preserved through control. It had been sustained through understanding. And now that understanding had deepened. The empire was no longer defined by its influence alone. It was defined by its ability to remain steady, clear, and present, regardless of the changes beyond its walls. As night settled once more over Constantinople, the lights flickered gently, unchanged and enduring. And within that quiet persistence, the empire found something more lasting than control. It found continuity, a way to exist not above the world, but within it, not shaping every outcome, but remaining part of the ongoing flow of history. And in that, perhaps, lay the true secret of its peaceful survival, not the avoidance of change, but the acceptance of it. Because in the end, what endured was not power alone, but presence, and presence, when maintained with care, could outlast even the greatest shifts of time. The city slept, the empire remained, and the story, though quieter now, was far from over. The empire did not celebrate its transformation. There were no proclamations, no ceremonies marking the shift from influence to presence, from control to continuity. Instead, the change settled into daily life so quietly that, over time, it began to feel as though it had always been this way. But beneath that calm acceptance, something deeper was unfolding, because once an empire learns how to let go, it must also learn what to hold on to. Anna discovered this in the archives. She had been asked to review older correspondences, letters written years ago, during the height of the empire's quiet influence. As she unrolled each parchment, she found a different tone, a different rhythm. Those letters were layered, careful, almost invisible in their persuasion. They had shaped outcomes without appearing to do so. Now, as she compared them to her recent work, the difference felt almost striking. The new letters were clearer, more direct, less concerned with subtle influence, and more focused on steady communication. Neither approach was wrong, but they belonged to different versions of the empire. She paused over one particularly intricate letter from the past, tracing the elegance of its phrasing. It was masterful in its design, guiding the reader gently toward a desired conclusion. Then she set it aside. That era, she realized, had passed. In the marketplace, Theodoros noticed a similar reflection of past and present. Older merchants still spoke of the days when Constantinople was the unavoidable center of trade, when nearly every route passed through its gates. Younger traders, however, spoke differently. They talked about networks, connections that spread outward in many directions, rather than converging in one place. For them, The city was still important, but it was part of a larger system, not the heart of it. Theodoros listened without disagreement. He had lived through both realities, and he understood that neither one was permanent. At the gates, Marcus observed that the sense of tension that had once sharpened every movement had now settled into something steadier. Travelers moved with quiet confidence. Guards maintained their watch without the need for constant adjustment. The balance had returned, but it was not the same balance as before. It was looser, more flexible, and perhaps in some ways more resilient. Inside the palace, the emperor gathered his advisors once again, though the urgency that had once filled these meetings had faded. What remained was something quieter: reflection, refinement, and a careful consideration of the future. "We have adapted to the world as it is," one advisor said. "Yes," the emperor replied, "but the world will continue to change, and so must we." The emperor nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "Not endlessly," he said. The advisors exchanged glances. There was a limit, he knew, to how much an empire could change before it lost its identity entirely. Adaptation was necessary, but it could not come at the cost of becoming something unrecognizable. That was the next balance to maintain. Chain without losing self. Anna received a new kind of assignment, one that did not involve responding to others, but defining the empire's own voice moving forward. It was not a directive filled with detailed instructions. It was a question: what do we say when we are not trying to influence? She sat with it for a long time, because the answer was not obvious. For years, every word had carried intention beyond its surface. Now, she was being asked to write without that hidden layer, to communicate openly, honestly, and with clarity. It felt almost unfamiliar, but also freeing. At the harbor, Theodoros began forming new partnerships, not large, sweeping agreements, but smaller, more personal arrangements with traders he trusted. These relationships were not built on the empire's position. They were built on mutual understanding, and they proved just as reliable. Eleni, watching the city from her window, noticed something she had not seen before: not a change in movement, but a change in pace. Everything felt unhurried, not slow, not stagnant, just steady, as if the city had found a rhythm that no longer depended on constant adjustment. Marcus, standing beneath the evening sky, realized that his role had subtly shifted. He was no longer guarding against immediate threats or preparing for sudden changes. He was maintaining continuity, ensuring that what existed remained stable. It was a quieter responsibility, but no less important. In the palace, the emperor stood once more before the map, though it had taken on a new meaning. It was no longer a tool for guiding influence or tracking change. It was a reminder of how far the empire had come, of how much it had adjusted, and of what still remained unchanged. He traced the outline of Constantinople with his finger, the city at the center of it all, not because it controlled everything, but because it endured. That, he realized, was the true foundation of their survival. Not dominance, not strategy, but endurance itself. Anna finally began writing her response to the question she had been given. It was not a letter to any specific ruler. It was something broader, a reflection of the empire's presence, its stability, its role in a changing world. She wrote simply, clearly, without hidden intention. And when she finished, she felt a quiet certainty that had not been there before. This was not the voice of an empire trying to shape the world. It was the voice of an empire that understood its place within it. Theodoros closed his stall at the end of the day, his business steady, his expectations aligned with the new patterns that had become familiar. He no longer looked for the old ways to return. He had accepted the new ones. Marcus adjusted his stance slightly as the night deepened, his awareness calm and steady. He no longer anticipated disruption. He anticipated continuation. Eleni listened to the quiet of the evening, the city's rhythm now so familiar, so consistent, that it felt almost timeless. And in the palace, the emperor stepped onto the balcony once more, the lights of Constantinople stretching out before him like a quiet promise. The empire had changed. It had adapted. It had let go of what it could no longer hold. And in doing so, it had discovered something unexpected. It did not need to control the world to remain part of it. It did not need to shape every outcome to endure. It only needed to remain steady, present, unbroken. As the night settled fully over the city, the calm was complete, not because nothing had changed, but because everything had found its place within that change. And for the Byzantine Empire, that was enough. Not an ending, not a final state, but a continuation, a quiet, enduring presence in a world that would continue to move, to shift, to evolve. And through it all, the empire would remain not as the center of everything, but as something perhaps even more lasting, a constant, a witness, a survivor. And as the stars reflected faintly on the waters of the Bosporus, the story carried on softly, steadily, and without the need for grand declarations, because some empires do not survive by resisting time. They survive by learning how to move with it. Time did not pause to admire what the empire had become. It moved as it always had, quietly, and without concern for balance or intention. And yet, within that movement, the Byzantine Empire continued, no longer trying to shape every current, but learning how to remain steady as those currents passed through and around it. The next change was not external. It came from within. Anna noticed it first in herself, where once she had written with the careful awareness of influence, then with the clarity of presence. She now found something else emerging in her work, a sense of authorship. not over outcomes, but over meaning. She was no longer just responding to the world. She was describing it. Her letters began to carry reflections, subtle observations about stability, continuity, and shared experience. They were not directives. They were not even suggestions. They were perspectives. And in a world that had grown more independent, perspectives carried a different kind of value. Not something to follow, but something to consider. She did not announce this shift. She simply wrote, and those who read her words began to notice, not immediately, not consciously, but gradually. The empire's voice had changed again, not quieter, not louder, just deeper. At the marketplace, Theodoros experienced a similar change, though he would not have described it in the same way. His work had become less about reacting to shifts in supply and demand, and more about understanding the rhythm beneath them. He could sense when a delay was temporary, and when it signaled a longer adjustment. He could recognize patterns before they fully formed, not because he controlled them, but because he had learned to observe them closely. Customers began to trust his judgment more than his goods. "What do you think will happen?" one asked. Theodoros paused, considering. "It will settle," he said. "It always does." It was not certainty, but it was confidence. And confidence, when grounded in experience, became its own kind of stability. Marcus, at his post, found that his role required less reaction and more interpretation. There were fewer changes in orders, fewer adjustments to routine. Instead, he was expected to understand the patterns himself, to recognize when something small might carry larger meaning. He no longer waited for instruction. He anticipated, not in a way that created tension, but in a way that maintained balance. The city, he realized, was not being controlled. It was being understood. Inside the palace, the emperor sensed this internal shift as well. The advisors spoke less frequently now, but when they did, their words carried more weight. Discussions were not about immediate decisions, but about long-term understanding. "What have we become?" one advisor asked quietly. The emperor considered the question. It was no longer about survival. That had already been achieved. It was about definition. "We have become stable," he said. But even as he spoke the word, he knew it was incomplete. Stability alone did not capture the full transformation. There was something else, something less tangible. Anna's latest collection of letters was brought before him, not for approval, but for review. He read them slowly, noting the change in tone, not just clarity, not just presence, but insight. She was not telling others what to do. She was offering them a way to see, and that, he realized, was a different kind of influence, one that did not direct, but guided thought itself. Eleni, seated by her window as always, felt the change in a way that required no words. The city had grown quieter, not in sound, but in urgency. There was no longer a sense of waiting for something to happen. Things were happening, but they were no longer disruptive. They were part of the flow. Children played as they always had. Merchants traded, guards watched, ships arrived and departed. But beneath all of it, there was a shared understanding, unspoken, but present. Life would continue, not because it was controlled, but because it was sustained. Theodoros began to notice that his conversations with other traders had shifted from negotiation to exchange of ideas. They spoke less about price and more about direction, where trade was moving, how patterns were forming, what changes might come next. It was no longer about immediate gain. It was about shared awareness. Marcus observed that even the travelers who passed through the gates carried themselves differently. They were less cautious, less uncertain, not careless, but comfortable, as if the city itself had become a place of continuity, a point in the world where movement could pause without disruption. In the palace, the emperor stood once more before the balcony, though now his gaze extended beyond the city itself. He looked outward, toward a world that continued to evolve in ways no empire could fully contain. And yet, the Byzantine Empire remained part of it, not as a ruler, not as a center, but as something steady, something reliable, something understood. He realized then that the empire had not lost its influence. It had transformed it from something applied to something inherent. Anna finished another letter, her hand steady, her thoughts clear. She no longer questioned the purpose of her work. It was not about guiding outcomes or maintaining connections. It was about contributing to a shared understanding of stability, a quiet, enduring presence within a changing world. Eleni closed her window as night settled once more, the city's rhythm unchanged, its presence steady. She did not think of empires or influence or strategy. She simply recognized that things felt right, not perfect, but balanced. Theodoros packed away his goods at the end of the day, his records now less about tracking uncertainty and more about observing continuity. He no longer needed to predict every change. He trusted the patterns to reveal themselves. Marcus stood beneath the stars, his posture calm, his awareness steady. He no longer watched for disruption. He watched for meaning. And in the palace, the emperor allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. The questions that had once guided every decision had softened, replaced by something quieter. Understanding, the Byzantine Empire had not just survived peacefully. It had learned how to exist within peace, to contribute to it, to reflect it, not by controlling it, but by embodying it. As the night deepened and the lights of Constantinople flickered gently against the darkness, the empire's presence felt less like a force and more like a foundation, something that did not need to assert itself to be felt, something that endured not through action alone, but through consistency, clarity, and quiet strength. And as time continued its steady passage, the story moved forward, not toward an ending, but toward a deeper understanding of what it meant to last. Because in the end, the Byzantine Empire did not simply survive. It became something else entirely. Something quieter, something steadier, something that would remain, even as everything else continued to change. And in that transformation, it found a different kind of permanence, one that did not depend on power at all. The empire did not notice the moment it became something enduring. There was no single turning point, no day marked in records where everything shifted from adaptation to permanence. Instead, the transformation settled over time, layer by layer, until it became inseparable from the daily life of Constantinople itself. And yet, even permanence carries within it the possibility of change. That realization began to take shape in subtle ways, so quiet that only those who had lived through the earlier transformations could fully recognize it. Anna felt it as she revisited her own writing. Her letters had evolved from persuasion to clarity, from clarity to reflection. And now they seemed to move toward something even more restrained. Fewer words, simpler phrasing, not because there was less to say, but because less was needed. Understanding no longer required elaboration. The empire's voice had become familiar enough that it did not need to explain itself at length. A few carefully chosen sentences carried the same weight that once required pages. She found herself pausing more often before writing, not to plan influence, but to remove anything unnecessary. What remained was essence. At the marketplace, Theodoros experienced a similar quiet refinement. His records, once detailed and cautious, had become simpler. He no longer tracked every minor fluctuation, only the patterns that mattered. He had learned what to ignore, and in that, he found a kind of ease that had not existed before. Customers noticed that he spoke less, but when he did, his words carried certainty. "Will things remain stable?" one asked. Theodoros smiled faintly. "For now," he said. It was not a promise, but it was enough. Marcus, standing at his post, realized that his role had reached a similar point of refinement. There were fewer instructions, fewer adjustments, fewer moments requiring immediate action. Instead, there was consistency. He understood his place without needing to be told. He recognized patterns without needing to analyze them consciously. His awareness had become instinctive. The city moved. He remained steady within it. Inside the palace, the emperor sensed this same quiet settling across every level of the empire. The urgency that had once defined leadership had faded, replaced by something deeper. Confidence, not the kind that demands recognition, but the kind that no longer requires it. The advisors spoke less frequently, but their discussions carried clarity. Decisions were made without hesitation, not because they were simple, but because the framework for understanding them had become so well established, we have reached a kind of balance, one advisor observed. The emperor nodded. Yes, he said, but balance is never permanent. The words were not a warning. They were a reminder. Even the most stable systems exist within a world that continues to shift. The empire had learned how to adapt, how to refine, how to endure, but it could not assume that this state would remain unchanged forever. Anna received fewer letters now, but each one carried greater significance. Communication had become less frequent, but more meaningful. There was no longer a need for constant exchange. Relationships had stabilized. Understanding had deepened. She wrote her replies with the same quiet clarity, knowing that each word would be read not just for its content, but for its presence. Eleni, seated by her window, felt the same steady calm that had settled over the city in recent days. There was no tension, no uncertainty lingering beneath the surface, just continuity. She watched as her grandchildren moved through their games with effortless ease, their laughter echoing against the stone walls. For them, this stability was not something new. It was simply the way the world was. And perhaps, she thought, that was the truest sign of the empire's transformation. When stability becomes ordinary, it no longer feels fragile. At the harbor, Theodoros noticed that the flow of goods had reached a new kind of equilibrium. Not the rigid consistency of the past, but a flexible steadiness that adapted naturally to small changes without disruption. Ships arrived, goods moved, life continued without the need for constant adjustment. Marcus observed that the travelers passing through the gates carried themselves with quiet confidence. There was no hesitation, no sense of uncertainty. The city had become a place of reliability, a point in the world where movement could pause without concern. And in the palace, the emperor stood once more before the balcony, the familiar lights of Constantinople stretching out before him. He had spent years guiding the empire through change, shaping its responses, maintaining its balance. Now he realized the empire no longer required constant guidance. It had learned, not just as a system, but as a living presence. Its people understood, its rhythms held, its identity remained intact, even as the world around it continued to evolve. He allowed himself a moment of stillness, not because there was nothing left to do, but because the need for constant action had passed. Anna finished a letter and set it aside, her work complete for the day. She no longer felt the quiet tension that had once accompanied every word. There was no need to anticipate every outcome, only to contribute to the ongoing continuity. Eleni closed her window as night settled once more, the city's calm unbroken. She did not think of the past or the future. She simply experienced the present, and in that present, everything felt complete. Theodoros closed his stall, his records simple, his expectations aligned with the steady patterns that had emerged. He no longer questioned the changes that had brought them here. He accepted them. Marcus stood beneath the stars, his posture relaxed, his awareness steady. He did not watch for disruption. He watched for continuation. And in the palace, the emperor turned away from the balcony, the quiet understanding settling within him. The Byzantine Empire had not just survived, it had become something that could endure without constant effort, a presence, a continuity, a steady point within a moving world. But even as that realization settled, he knew one thing remained true. Time would continue, change would return, and when it did, the empire would once again be tested, not in its ability to control or adapt, but in its ability to remain true to what it had become. Because endurance was not a final state. It was an ongoing process, one that required awareness, even in moments of calm. As the night deepened and the city rested, the empire remained steady, quiet, and enduring, not as a force that shaped the world, but as something that moved with it. And in that movement, it found a different kind of strength, one that did not fade with time, but evolved alongside it. The story, though calm, continued. The calm that had settled over Constantinople was not fragile, but it was not immovable either. It only felt that way because the changes now came from deeper layers, less visible, more internal, and therefore harder to recognize at first glance. The empire had learned to survive storms. Now it was learning something far more subtle: how to survive stillness that could eventually turn into something else. Anna sensed this before it became obvious, not through letters this time, but through the absence of urgency in them. Messages still arrived, still carried meaning, still required responses. But fewer of them demanded direction, fewer asked for guidance, fewer expected the empire to shape their outcome. Instead, they informed, they updated, they acknowledged. The world was no longer waiting for Byzantium to respond. It was simply continuing. She sat by her desk longer than usual that morning, not writing, just reading the flow of correspondence. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of a parchment as she observed something she had not fully articulated before. The empire was no longer a center of coordination. It had become a reference point. That distinction mattered more than it first appeared. A center pulls everything inward. A reference point allows movement around it. And in that shift lay both freedom and distance. Anna finally began writing, but her approach had changed again. There was no longer an attempt to shape tone or influence interpretation. Instead, she focused on precision, ensuring that what was meant was exactly what was understood. Clarity had replaced subtlety. At the marketplace, Theodoros had begun noticing a strange comfort in predictability that was no longer imposed from above, but generated from within the system itself. Trade no longer depended on imperial coordination to function smoothly. Local agreements, regional understanding, and independent routes had formed their own stability. He adjusted his stall as usual, arranging goods with careful familiarity. But now he did so within a structure that felt self-sustaining. A young trader approached him, holding a small ledger. "Do you think the city still matters the way it used to?" the trader asked. Theodoros did not answer immediately. It was not a simple question. Finally, he said, "It matters differently now." The trader frowned slightly, as if trying to interpret that. Theodoros added, "Before, everything passed through it. Now, many things pass beside it. But that does not mean it is less important." It was the best explanation he could offer. Not decline, not dominance, transformation. Marcus noticed the change in movement at the gates as well. Fewer large convoys, more dispersed arrivals. Instead of concentrated bursts of activity, there was a steady flow distributed across time. The rhythm had become smoother, less dependent on peaks and pauses. He found himself thinking less about security in terms of events and more in terms of patterns. What was normal? What was deviation? And increasingly, what counted as deviation was becoming harder to define. Inside the palace, the emperor reviewed reports that reflected this same shift. The empire was no longer at the center of diplomatic alignment, but it remained present in nearly every network of exchange, not as an authority, not as an enforcer, but as a stabilizer. "We are no longer shaping outcomes," one advisor said carefully. The emperor nodded. "We are shaping expectations." That distinction was important. Outcomes belonged to those who acted. Expectations belonged to those who endured. And endurance, in this phase of the empire's existence, had become its defining trait. Anna received a message that was neither request nor report, but something closer to acknowledgement. A distant ruler nodding the continuation of a previous understanding without asking for confirmation or approval. She read it twice. There was a time when such a message would have required careful response. Now it simply required recognition. She replied briefly, not because more was needed, but because connections still mattered, even when it no longer directed flow. At the harbor, Theodoros observed ships docking with increasing regularity that no longer depended on imperial scheduling. Instead, timing had become self-organized across regions, each adapting to the others in a loosely coordinated rhythm. It was not controlled, but it was coordinated nonetheless. He found that concept fascinating. Order without central command. Marcus adjusted his patrol route slightly, not because of instruction, but because of observation. A particular pattern of movement among travelers suggested a shift in seasonal flow. Nothing alarming, just something to account for. He no longer waited for orders to interpret change. He interpreted change as part of his duty. Eleni, from her window, noticed that the feeling of anticipation that had once lingered in the city had fully dissolved. There was no longer a sense that something was about to happen. Things were simply happening, and life continued within them. She folded her hands quietly, watching the light shift across the rooftops. The city had become something different from what it once was. Not more powerful, not less powerful, but more settled, as if it had found its place within time rather than standing against it. In the palace, the emperor stood before the same map that had once been used to track influence, then continuity. Now, it served a different purpose entirely. It was no longer a tool for control. It was a record of relationships. He traced a line connecting Constantinople to a distant region, noticing how that connection had changed over time. Once strong, then flexible, now stable in a quieter way. It no longer required maintenance to exist. It simply persisted. That, he realized, was the final stage of influence, when it no longer needed to be applied. It simply remained. Anna finished her work for the day and did not feel the need to review it again. Her writing had become consistent enough that correction was rarely necessary. She closed her ledger gently. Outside, the city continued its steady rhythm, unaffected by internal reflection. Theodoros closed his stall as evening approached. His thoughts no longer focused on uncertainty, but on continuity. He no longer tracked change as disruption. He tracked it as variation within stability. Marcus stood at his post as night settled, his awareness calm, his attention steady. There was nothing to prepare for in the traditional sense, only patterns to observe, and within those patterns, meaning. Eleni watched the last light fade, the city glowing softly beneath the emerging stars. And in the palace, the emperor allowed himself a rare moment without analysis, without planning, without adjustment. The empire was no longer being shaped moment by moment. It was sustaining itself, not because it had reached an endpoint, but because it had learned how to continue without strain. That realization carried a quiet weight, because continuation, once achieved, is not a final achievement. It is a condition that must be maintained differently than before, not through control, not through influence, but through awareness. As Constantinople rested beneath the night sky, the empire did not feel like something that had arrived at stability. It felt like something that had learned how to exist within it. And that distinction would matter, because even the most enduring systems are never exempt from change. They simply learn how to recognize it earlier and respond more quietly. The Byzantine Empire had entered a phase where survival no longer meant resisting collapse. It meant understanding permanence as something active, not passive. And as the city continued its steady breath through the night, that understanding settled deeper, not as conclusion, but as continuation. always continuation. The empire no longer measured its survival in victories or crises. It measured it in continuity. That shift, once subtle, had now become the foundation of how everything functioned. Not because it was declared, but because it was lived. And yet, even continuity carries its own quiet tension. Anna began to notice it in the tone of the world around her, not in what people said, but in how confidently they said it. Messages no longer arrived with hesitation. Requests no longer carried uncertainty. Even disagreements, when they appeared, were structured, organized, predictable, almost procedural. It was as if the world had learned the rhythm the empire once taught it, and now no longer needed the teacher. She sat at her desk longer that morning, her hands resting beside a blank parchment before she began writing. For the first time in many years, she did not immediately know what the tone should be, not because the situation was unclear, but because everything was too clear. Clarity, she realized, could also create distance, so she wrote more simply than before, not to influence, not to interpret, but to maintain connection. At the marketplace, Theodoros had begun to feel something similar. Business remained steady, but conversations had changed. Traders were more independent, more self-directed. They no longer asked where goods should go or how routes should be arranged. They already knew. Systems had formed outside the empire's direct involvement, regional agreements, local stabilizations, independent flows of commerce that no longer needed central coordination. Theodoros adjusted his stall, arranging goods with practiced ease. A fellow merchant approached him. "Do you remember when everything depended on Constantinople?" the man asked. Theodoros paused briefly. "I remember when it felt like it did," he said. The distinction was important because dependency and perception were not always the same thing. Marcus, stationed near the gate, observed fewer instructions arriving from the palace. Not because communication had stopped, but because it had changed form. Instead of directives, he now received summaries. Instead of commands, patterns. He was expected to interpret more, decide more, trust more. At first, this might have felt like absence of structure, but over time, he realized it was something else entirely. Structure had not disappeared. It had been internalized. Inside the palace, the emperor listened as advisors reported on regions that once required constant oversight. Now, those regions maintained themselves with minimal intervention. "There is stability without us," one advisor said. The emperor corrected him gently. "Not without us," he replied. "Beyond us." That distinction mattered. Without us implied replacement. Beyond us implied expansion. The empire was no longer the sole source of order, but it remained part of a wider system of order that had evolved around it. Anna received a series of letters that reflected this shift. Some were acknowledgments of long-standing agreements. Others were confirmations of continued cooperation. None required urgent response. She found herself writing less in response to events and more in reflection of them. The empire was no longer reacting to the world. It was observing itself within the world. At the harbor, Theodoros noticed that ships now followed schedules that aligned with multiple regions simultaneously. No single authority dictated flow. Instead, coordination emerged naturally from overlapping systems. He found this almost elegant, not controlled, but harmonized. Eleni, watching from her window, sensed something that she could not easily define. The city felt stable in a way that no longer required attention to maintain. It simply was. Children played without awareness of larger shifts. Merchants worked without concern for disruption. Guards stood watch without expectation of alarm. And yet, beneath all of it, something had quietly changed. Not in structure, but in dependency. The city was no longer the center of gravity for everything around it. It was one of many stable points in a wider world. Marcus adjusted his stance slightly as evening approached. He no longer thought in terms of guarding against change. He thought in terms of recognizing it early. Change was no longer an event. It was a condition. Inside the palace, the emperor walked slowly along the balcony, observing the city that had defined so much of the empire's history. Constantinople still felt central to him, not because of control, but because of memory. But he understood now that memory and reality were not identical. The world had expanded, and the empire had expanded with it. Even if not physically, its influence was no longer concentrated. It was distributed. That realization did not diminish its importance. It redefined it. Anna finished her writing and placed the parchment aside. She no longer felt the need to review every word multiple times. Not because precision had become less important, but because precision had become instinctive. The system she worked within had matured. At the marketplace, Theodoros closed his stall earlier than usual, not because of lack of business, but because there was no need to remain longer. Activity had become predictable enough that effort could be optimized naturally. He walked home slowly, noticing how the city felt less like a place of urgency and more like a place of continuity. Marcus stood beneath the fading light, his awareness steady. He no longer expected sudden instructions or rapid shifts in responsibility. His role had become interpretive rather than reactive. Eleni closed her window as night settled once more, her expression calm. She did not analyze what had changed. She simply lived within it. And in the palace, the emperor remained still for a long moment, observing the lights of Constantinople spread across the darkness. He understood now that the empire had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer defined by its ability to adapt, nor by its ability to influence. It was defined by its ability to remain coherent, while everything around it became more complex. That was not a final achievement. It was an ongoing condition, one that required attention, even in stillness, because systems that stabilize too completely risk becoming unaware of the changes forming beyond their perception. And awareness, he knew, was the empire's true inheritance. Not dominance, not control, but the ability to recognize patterns early enough to remain part of them. As the night deepened, Constantinople continued its quiet rhythm, and beneath that rhythm, the Byzantine Empire continued as well, not as a force that shaped everything around it, but as a steady presence within a world that no longer depended on it entirely, yet still moved with it. And in that movement, something subtle endured. Not power, not control, but continuity refined into awareness, and awareness refined into survival. The story did not conclude here. It simply continued, as all enduring systems must, quietly, steadily, without needing to announce itself. The empire had reached a point where even its stability began to feel like something that required observation, not because it was weakening, but because it had become so consistent that any deviation, no matter how small, stood out more sharply than before. Anna noticed it in a single sentence, a line in a routine correspondence that did not match the established rhythm of recent communication. It was not dramatic. It did not signal conflict. It was simply different in phrasing, as if the sender had subtly shifted their internal logic. She read it again, then compared it to earlier messages from the same source. The difference was real, small, but real, and in a system that had become highly coherent. Small differences mattered more than large disruptions once had. She set the parchment aside, her expression calm but attentive. For the first time in a long while, she did not immediately respond. Instead, she observed. At the marketplace, Theodoros experienced a similar sensation, though he would not have described it in such formal terms. A set of prices that had remained stable for weeks shifted slightly overnight. Not enough to cause imbalance, not enough to disrupt trade, but enough to be noticed. He recalculated quietly, then adjusted nothing. Instead, he waited, because he had learned something important over time. Not every variation required correction. Some variations resolved themselves when left within a stable system. Marcus, at the gate, felt the change through movement rather than information. A convoy arrived earlier than expected, then another later than scheduled. The irregularity was minor, but it broke a pattern that had become familiar. He did not escalate it. He simply recorded it. Patterns mattered more than events, and patterns were still intact. Inside the palace, the emperor reviewed a broader set of reports than usual. Not because of urgency, because he had begun to understand that the empire's greatest risk was no longer external pressure. It was internal assumption, the assumption that stability meant permanence. That is not the same thing, he said quietly to the advisors. One of them nodded. We have been stable for long enough that stability feels normal, which makes change harder to see, the emperor added. That was the danger, not collapse, but invisibility of transition. Anna finally responded to the unusual correspondence, but she did so differently than before. Instead of reinforcing existing tone, she acknowledged the variation. A simple sentence, not corrective, not interpretive, just recognition. It was a small change in writing style, but it reflected a deeper shift in understanding. The empire was no longer maintaining a single, consistent voice. It was maintaining awareness of multiple tones existing simultaneously. At the harbor, Theodoros observed something else subtle but significant. Two trading groups arrived with slightly different expectations of scheduling. In the past, this would have caused friction. Now, both groups adjusted without conflict. They had learned to adapt to each other without central coordination. He found that quietly impressive. Marcus noticed that reports from neighboring regions now contained fewer references to the empire itself. Not because the empire was ignored, but because it was no longer necessary to mention it in every context. Its presence was assumed. That realization carried weight. To be assumed meant to be embedded, not visible in every action, but underlying many of them. Inside the palace, the emperor stood before the map again. But this time, he did not trace influence or connections. He observed density, where interactions were thick, where they were thinning, where they were self-sustaining. We are no longer organizing the system, he said. We are part of its structure. An advisor replied. The emperor nodded. Yes, he said, and structures do not command systems. They support them. That distinction marked another stage in the empire's transformation. Anna began to notice that her writing no longer needed to adapt constantly. Instead, it could remain consistent across varied correspondences. The empire's voice had stabilized into something that could hold multiple interpretations without losing coherence. She found that this reduced effort, but increased responsibility, because clarity now required precision, not in persuasion, but in neutrality. At the marketplace, Theodoros realized that he was no longer tracking changes as anomalies. He was tracking them as variations within a larger equilibrium. His mindset had shifted from correction to interpretation. Marcus adjusted his posture slightly as evening approached. He no longer waited for instructions to understand his environment. He read it directly. Patterns of movement, frequency of arrivals, shifts in timing, all of it formed a language that required no translation. Eleni, from her window, sensed something she could not fully articulate. The city felt as though it had become self-explanatory, no longer dependent on interpretation to function smoothly. It simply functioned. She closed her eyes briefly and accepted it without question. Inside the palace, the emperor met with Anna directly for the first time in many days. She presented a selection of recent communications, now categorized not by origin or importance, but by pattern stability. Some systems are beginning to operate independently of central reinforcement, she said. Yes, the emperor replied. He studied her classification for a moment. And does that concern you? He asked. Anna considered the question. No, she said. It changes what we need to observe. The emperor nodded slowly. That was the correct response. Not resistance, not control, observation, because the empire was no longer in a position where it could or should attempt to direct every outcome. Instead, it had become something that ensured coherence across outcomes, a stabilizing presence within a distributed system. At the harbor, Theodoros closed his ledger earlier than usual, not because of reduced activity, but because activity had become efficient enough that extended oversight was unnecessary. He walked through the city slowly, noticing how movement no longer felt centralized around any single point. It was distributed, balanced. Marcus stood at the gate as night arrived, his awareness calm. There were no anomalies to report, but he no longer interpreted the absence of anomalies as absence of change. He understood that change now occurred at a different scale and required a different kind of attention. Anna returned to her desk one final time that day, writing a short note summarizing observed variations. It was not directed outward as instruction. It was inward as documentation, a record of coherence, not enforcement, but awareness. Eleni watched the city settle into night once again. The rhythm remained steady, but she understood now that steadiness itself was not static. It was maintained continuously, quietly. The emperor stood alone on the balcony, the wind moving softly through the high air above Constantinople. He did not think of survival anymore. That phase had passed. Now he thought of endurance as participation. The empire was no longer separate from the systems it had once influenced so directly. It was embedded within them, a stabilizing presence in a world that had learned how to organize itself. And that meant its role had changed again. Not less important, but differently important. As the lights of the city flickered beneath the night sky, the Byzantine Empire continued, not as a center, not as a controller, but as a structured awareness within a larger, evolving order. And in that state, it remained steady, not because nothing changed, but because it understood change well enough to move with it, without needing to stop it. The empire began to notice something it had never fully accounted for before. not change itself, but self-sustaining change. For centuries, every transformation within and around Byzantium had been either absorbed, guided, or responded to. Even when the empire no longer directly controlled outcomes, its presence had remained an underlying reference point for adjustment. Now, however, patterns were forming that no longer referenced it at all. Anna encountered this first in a set of correspondences that felt structurally complete without imperial involvement. Agreements were being formed, maintained, and resolved entirely within external systems. The empire was neither excluded nor consulted. It was simply absent from the process. She read one such report carefully. There was no error, no omission. The system described within it was functioning coherently on its own terms. She placed it down slowly. This was not instability. It was independence reaching maturity. At the marketplace, Theodoros began to observe similar developments in trade networks that no longer intersected with Constantinople at predictable intervals. Entire flows of goods moved between regions without passing through the city, yet still maintained balance and efficiency. The city was no longer a mandatory node. It had become optional, not in importance, but in structure. He did not feel alarmed. Instead, he adjusted his thinking again. If systems could function without central passage points, then value had to be measured differently, not by control of flow, but by participation in it. Marcus noticed a quieter version of the same shift at the gates. Fewer structured convoys, more fluid movement. Travelers arrived with documentation already aligned across multiple regions, requiring minimal adjustment upon entry. It was as if coordination had migrated outward, distributed across systems that no longer needed a single organizer. He stood watching for longer than usual, not because something was wrong, but because something fundamental had changed in how order manifested. Inside the palace, the emperor received reports that reflected this evolution in increasing clarity. The empire was still respected, still engaged with, still acknowledged, but less frequently as a necessary component of coordination, more often as a historical anchor, a reference of stability that had shaped earlier structures, but no longer governed current ones. One advisor phrased it carefully. We are becoming less central to function, but more central to memory. The emperor considered this. Memory is not passive, he said. It shapes future expectation. That was true. Even absence could become influential if it remained recognized. Anna was asked to prepare a summary, not of influence, but of presence. A documentation of how the empire existed within systems it no longer directly engaged with. She approached it differently than her previous work. Instead of describing interactions, she mapped relationships. Instead of tracing outcomes, she traced dependencies that had once existed and now persisted only as structural memory. It was a strange exercise to describe relevance without direct involvement. At the harbor, Theodoros encountered a group of traders who spoke of Constantinople not as a center, but as a stabilizing landmark, something used for calibration rather than coordination. You don't go there to connect systems anymore, one of them said. You go there to verify they still align, another added. Theodoros listened carefully. That distinction mattered more than it first appeared. Verification instead of integration. Marcus adjusted patrol patterns slightly, not because of instruction, but because of observed distribution changes in movement density. He no longer saw the city as a focal point of incoming flow. He saw it as part of a network of checks and balances that existed beyond physical proximity. His role had become interpretive in a different way, less about guarding, more about understanding alignment. Eleni, watching from her window, felt a subtle change in how the city seemed to exist in her perception. It was no longer a place surrounded by external forces. It was one point among many similar points in a wider, steady system. She did not feel loss in this realization, only perspective. Inside the palace, the emperor stood before the map again. But this time, it had changed meaning entirely. Lines still existed, but they no longer represented influence or coordination. They represented interaction density, where systems intersected, where they overlapped, where they no longer required guidance. We are part of something distributed, he said quietly. Yes, an advisor replied. And distribution reduces dependency. The emperor shook his head slightly. Not dependency, he corrected. Concentration. That distinction mattered deeply. Dependency implied loss of function without presence. Concentration implied aggregation of function around presence. The empire was no longer the only structure maintaining order, but it remained one of the most stable ones within the larger system. Anna completed her report and realized something unexpected. She no longer needed to justify the empire's relevance, only describe its state. And that state was self-evident within the broader system. At the marketplace, Theodoros closed his stall earlier than usual, not due to demand, but due to equilibrium. Trade had reached a point where extended oversight was unnecessary. Systems regulated themselves. Marcus stood at his post beneath a sky that felt unchanged, though his perception of it had shifted again. He no longer waited for instruction or escalation. He observed coherence across movement patterns that extended beyond immediate visibility. And in that coherence, he found structure. Eleni closed her eyes briefly as evening deepened. The city's rhythm continued, but she no longer interpreted it as central or peripheral. It was simply part of a larger continuity. Inside the palace, The emperor walked slowly through the inner hallways, his steps unhurried. The empire had moved beyond phases of survival, adaptation, and stabilization. It had entered a phase of participation, not in control, not in isolation, but in distributed balance. And that required a different kind of leadership, not one that directed, but one that recognized. Anna returned to her desk once more, writing not to influence or interpret, but to document coherence as it existed across systems no longer dependent on a single center. Her words were precise, minimal, clear, and sufficient. Theodoros, Marcus, and Eleni each experienced the same underlying realization in different forms. The empire was no longer the organizing principle of its world. It was one of several stabilizing structures within it. And that was enough, because survival had evolved into something broader, not endurance alone, but integration without dominance. As night settled over Constantinople, the lights of the city reflected not central power, but distributed continuity. And within that continuity, the Byzantine Empire remained not as a singular force shaping everything around it, but as a steady component of a system that now sustained itself. And that realization marked another quiet transition, not an ending, not a decline, but a deeper form of existence within complexity, one that required less control and more understanding. The empire had entered a stage where even understanding itself required new language. Old terms no longer fully applied. Words like control, influence, center, even stability, each carried meanings that had slowly drifted from their original weight. They were still used, but they no longer described reality with precision. Anna felt this most sharply in her work. She had been asked to compile a synthesis of recent observations, not a report of events, but a description of how systems now related to one another. As she read through gathered materials, she realized something unsettling and fascinating at the same time. There was no longer a single pattern to describe. Instead, there were overlapping patterns that interacted without merging. She paused, pen hovering above parchment. How does one describe a structure that is no longer singular? She did not answer immediately. Instead, she wrote carefully, introducing a new phrase into the imperial archive: layered coherence. It was not official terminology, not yet, but it described what she was observing more accurately than anything previously used. At the marketplace, Theodoros had begun to experience something similar in trade dynamics. Markets no longer responded uniformly to changes. Instead, different segments reacted independently while still maintaining overall balance. It was as if the system had developed multiple internal rhythms, each stable on its own, together forming something larger. A young trader approached him, holding a shipment list, Why does everything feel coordinated without coordination? The trader asked. Theodoros considered the question. Because coordination has become internal, he replied. The trader frowned. That doesn't make sense. Theodoros smiled slightly. It doesn't have to make sense anymore, he said. It only has to function. Marcus observed a comparable transformation in movement patterns near the gates. Travelers arrived from different regions with documentation that was no longer standardized by any single authority. Yet, processing remained smooth. Different systems had learned to recognize each other's structures, not because they were unified, but because they were compatible. He found himself thinking less in terms of rules and more in terms of interfaces, how systems interacted, how they aligned without merging. Inside the palace, the emperor listened as advisors presented a growing concern that no longer felt like a problem, but rather a condition of existence. We are no longer operating at the center of coordination, one said carefully. We are one of several stable references, another added. The emperor nodded slowly. And is that a loss? He asked. Silence followed. Then the first advisor answered honestly. It depends on whether centrality is still necessary. That question lingered because it pointed toward something deeper than strategy. It questioned the structure of necessity itself. Anna submitted her synthesis to the archive. It did not propose action. It did not suggest reform. It simply described observed patterns across systems that no longer depended on singular coordination. The response she received was minimal. Acknowledgement, not approval, not correction, just recognition that the document had been integrated into ongoing observation. At the harbor, Theodoros noticed that shipping routes had begun to adjust dynamically based on regional conditions rather than centralized planning. If one path slowed, others expanded naturally to compensate. Balance was maintained without instruction. He stood for a moment, watching cargo move with effortless adjustment. It was not chaotic. It was distributed intelligence, expressed through movement. Marcus, during his patrol, realized that even his own perception of normal had shifted again. He no longer defined normal as repetition of past patterns. He defined it as consistency within change, a moving equilibrium. Eleni, from her window, sensed that the city no longer felt like a place responding to external forces. It felt like part of a broader system that adjusted itself continuously. She did not find this alarming, only different. Inside the palace, the emperor walked alone through a corridor lined with old records. Scrolls documenting earlier eras of the empire times when decisions were direct, outcomes centralized, and influence clearly directional. He stopped briefly, reading one passage, then moved on. Those structures had not failed. They had simply evolved into something broader than they were designed for. Anna was called to a quiet meeting where she presented her concept of layered coherence to a small group of senior advisors. They listened without interruption. When she finished, one of them spoke carefully. If systems are layered rather than unified, then no single intervention can fully stabilize them. Anna nodded. That is correct, she said. The advisor continued. Then stability is not achieved. It is maintained continuously, she replied. The emperor, who had been listening, finally spoke. Then we are no longer architects of stability, he said. We are participants in its maintenance. That statement reframed everything. At the marketplace, Theodoros began to notice that pricing itself had become less reactive and more adaptive. Instead of responding to changes after they occurred, markets adjusted preemptively based on predictive alignment between systems. He did not fully understand how this emerged, but he recognized its effect. Marcus adjusted his stance again, not because of command, but because observation indicated a slight shift in flow density beyond the gate. Nothing concerning, just evolution in distribution. He no longer separated internal and external systems in his thinking. Everything was part of a continuous field of interaction. Eleni closed her eyes for a moment as evening deepened. The city was no longer something she interpreted as stable or unstable. It simply existed within continuity, and continuity itself had become the only constant she recognized. Inside the palace, the emperor returned to the balcony, looking out over Constantinople as he had done so many times before. But this time, his perspective was different. He was no longer viewing the city as the center of an empire, nor even as the anchor of a system. He saw it as one node within a larger, distributed equilibrium, stable not because it controlled, but because it participated correctly. Anna returned to her desk and began drafting a final reflection for the day's synthesis. She wrote slowly, carefully, aware that language itself was evolving alongside the systems it described. Stability, she wrote, is no longer a fixed condition. It is an emergent property of aligned systems operating without central dependency. She paused, then added one final line. The empire persists not by dominance, but by coherence. Theodoros closed his stall without reflection on change, because change had become part of continuity. Marcus stood under the night sky, no longer searching for disruption, only alignment. Eleni listened to the quiet of the city, no longer interpreting it as peaceful or shifting, and the emperor, standing above it all, understood that the Byzantine Empire had reached a form of existence that earlier eras could not have defined. It was not an endpoint. It was not a decline. It was a transition into distributed permanence, a state in which survival no longer depended on resistance or control, but on participation within systems that now sustained themselves. And as the night deepened once more over Constantinople, the empire remained not as a singular force shaping history, but as a stable pattern within it, continuous, adaptive, and quietly enduring. The concept of permanence, once so carefully constructed within the empire's understanding of itself, began to feel less like a destination and more like a moving threshold. Each time it was reached, it shifted slightly forward. Anna realized this while reviewing a long sequence of system reports that now described interactions between multiple regional structures. The empire was still present in many of them, but no longer as a central coordinator. Instead, it appeared as a stabilizing reference point that systems occasionally aligned with when necessary. What struck her most was not absence, but symmetry. Different systems were no longer orbiting a single center. They were aligning with each other directly. She traced one diagram in the report, noticing how two distant regions had formed a direct coordination loop without passing through Constantinople at any stage. This would once have been impossible. Now it was normal. She wrote a note in the margin. Direct inter-system alignment increasing. No judgment, just observation. At the marketplace, Theodoros encountered the same phenomenon in a more practical form. Traders from different regions were now engaging in direct agreements without intermediary negotiation. Prices adjusted instantly based on shared understanding rather than centralized recommendation. He no longer felt like a gatekeeper of economic flow. He felt like a participant in a larger network that had learned to self-correct. A younger merchant approached him. "Does the city still matter the way it used to?" The merchant asked again, echoing older questions that had returned in new form. Theodoros thought for a moment. "It matters," he said, "but not because everything passes through it." The merchant waited. Theodoros continued, "It matters because it remains consistent while everything else adjusts around it." The merchant nodded slowly, as if trying to understand a shift in logic rather than fact. Marcus, at the gate, observed fewer bottlenecks and more distributed flows. Instead of large convoys requiring structured passage, smaller synchronized movements occurred continuously across different times and routes. The system no longer depended on central timing. It had developed its own distributed timing logic. He found this concept difficult to describe, even internally. Time itself felt less centralized. Inside the palace, the emperor convened a smaller council than usual. The tone of discussion had changed over time, becoming less about intervention and more about interpretation. "We are no longer synchronizing systems," one advisor said. "We are observing synchronization as it emerges." Another added. The emperor listened carefully. "And what ensures coherence?" he asked. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Anna, who had been invited to present her synthesis work, responded. Shared reference stability, she said. The advisors turned toward her. She continued. Systems no longer require central control, but they require stable reference points to prevent divergence beyond compatibility. The emperor nodded slowly. That is what we have become, he said. A reference, not a controller, not a center, but a stable anchor within distributed complexity. At the harbor, Theodoros observed ships arriving in patterns that no longer followed predictable schedules, but still maintained equilibrium across supply and demand. Delays in one region were compensated by adjustments in others without delay in communication. It was as if the system anticipated itself. Marcus noted a similar phenomenon in movement through the gates. Travelers appeared with documentation that already accounted for conditions they had not yet physically encountered. Prediction had become embedded in structure. He no longer viewed this as unusual, only as advanced coherence. Eleni, watching from her window, sensed a subtle change in the city's atmosphere, not in activity, but in dependency. The city no longer felt like it was supporting or being supported by something external. It felt self-contained within a broader system that was itself stable. She closed her eyes briefly. There was no urgency in the air, only continuity. Inside the palace, the emperor walked slowly through a corridor lined with historical records again. But this time, he did not view them as past stages of a linear evolution. He saw them as layers within a larger structure, each stage still present in some form, not replaced, but integrated. Anna was asked to refine her concept of layered coherence further. She expanded it into a formal description. Multiple autonomous systems maintain stability through non-centralized alignment of reference states, allowing coherence without hierarchical dependency. When she submitted it, the response came quickly, acknowledged, integrated into systemic analysis framework. There was no debate, because the system itself had evolved to recognize such structures as normal. At the marketplace, Theodoros noticed that disruptions now resolved without visible intervention. When minor imbalances appeared, other parts of the system adjusted automatically, restoring equilibrium. He no longer needed to track correction. Correction had become distributed. Marcus adjusted his patrol pattern once more, not because of instruction, but because observation indicated shifting density in traveler movement. His role had become almost entirely interpretive. He no longer enforced order. He recognized order as it emerged. Eleni watched the city as night deepened. The lights of Constantinople no longer represented central authority or concentrated power. They represented continuity nodes within a larger field of stability. She did not analyze this. She simply observed it and found it sufficient. Inside the palace, the emperor returned to the balcony once more. The city stretched beneath him, unchanged in form, but transformed in function. He understood now that the empire's greatest transformation had not been in its policies or structures. It had been in its position, within systems beyond itself. From center to reference, from controller to participant, from singular authority to stable coherence node, Anna closed her documents for the day and felt no sense of completion or incompletion, only continuation. Theodoros finished his work without reflection on change, because change had become structure. Marcus stood at his post as night settled, no longer anticipating disruption, only alignment. Eleni remained by her window, no longer interpreting stability, only experiencing it. And the emperor, standing above them all, understood something quietly profound. The Byzantine Empire had not merely survived, it had transitioned into a form of existence that no longer depended on singularity. It existed as part of a distributed system of order, coherence, and continuity, not dominant, not diminished, but integrated. And in that integration, it had found a new kind of endurance, one that did not resist change, but absorbed it as part of itself. The story, once centered on survival, had become something else entirely, a study in how systems persist not by remaining unchanged, but by remaining aligned within change itself. And as Constantinople rested beneath the endless night sky, the empire continued, not as a center of history, but as one of its most stable patterns, quiet, continuous, and still unfolding. The empire had reached a point where even observation required restraint. Too much observation could distort what was being observed. Anna understood this more clearly than anyone now. The systems she studied were no longer fragile enough to be disrupted by attention, but they were subtle enough that interpretation itself could introduce bias. So she began to observe differently, less categorizing, more listening. She sat before a long sequence of reports that described interactions between multiple autonomous regions. For the first time, she did not attempt to map them into a single coherent diagram immediately. Instead, she let them exist side by side in her mind, separate, yet connected. What emerged was not a structure she could easily describe. It was a behavior, a pattern of adjustment across systems that did not require central direction, yet still produced stable outcomes over time. She wrote a single line in her notes: coherence without convergence, then paused, because that idea, once written, changed how everything else had to be interpreted. At the marketplace, Theodoros noticed that pricing had begun to stabilize across regions that had previously shown minor fluctuations. Not because they were unified under a common authority, but because they were responding to shared signals in real time. He no longer saw the market as a system influenced by the empire. He saw it as a system that included the empire as one of many stabilizing references. A trader approached him with a question that felt older than the current moment. If Constantinople stopped functioning as it does, would everything collapse? Theodoros did not answer immediately. He looked around at movement, exchange, coordination occurring without visible tension. Then he said carefully, "No." The trader frowned. "But it is still important." "Yes," Theodoros replied. "Just not in the way it used to be." He struggled to find a clearer explanation, then added, "It no longer holds everything together. It helps everything stay aligned." Marcus experienced a similar realization at the gates, though he never articulated it so clearly. He noticed that even when administrative processes slowed, external systems did not destabilize. They adjusted, compensated, and continued. The role of the gate had shifted. It was no longer a point of control. It was a point of verification, a place where alignment was confirmed rather than enforced. He found himself thinking less about security in traditional terms and more about consistency across systems. Inside the palace, the emperor gathered a small group once again. The tone of their discussion had evolved beyond governance into something closer to systems philosophy, though none of them would have named it that way. "We are no longer the source of order," one advisor said. "We are one of its reference layers," another added. The emperor nodded. "And what happens when reference layers conflict?" Silence followed. Anna responded. "Then systems adjust locally," she said, "until alignment reemerges across higher coherence levels." The emperor considered this carefully. "So instability is not eliminated," he said. "It is redistributed." Anna nodded. "Yes, but redistribution prevents systemic collapse." That distinction mattered deeply, because the empire had once been structured around preventing disruption at the center. Now it existed in a world where disruption was managed across distributed layers instead. At the harbor, Theodoros observed that delays no longer propagated in linear chains. Instead, they were absorbed and corrected across multiple nodes simultaneously. A delay in one region did not create cascading failure. It created compensatory adjustment. He found this both efficient and unsettling. Efficiency, without visible control, always carried a strange emotional weight. Marcus adjusted his posture as evening approached. He no longer expected patterns to remain fixed, only to remain coherent. That shift had changed how he perceived his entire role. He was no longer guarding a structure. He was monitoring a system in motion. Eleni, from her window, sensed something that was difficult to name. The city still felt stable, but stability no longer felt like stillness. It felt active, as if maintaining itself continuously in subtle ways she could not directly see. She no longer tried to interpret it fully. She simply accepted it. Inside the palace, the emperor stood before the map again. But now it served a different purpose entirely. It was no longer a representation of power or influence. It was a representation of interaction density across systems. He traced regions lightly, noticing how connections had become less hierarchical and more networked. No single center dominated flow. Instead, multiple stable nodes supported distributed coherence. Anna continued refining her documentation of layered coherence. Her latest formulation described something that had not been formally recognized before. Systemic stability emerges not from central control, but from synchronized adjustment across autonomous units sharing compatible reference states. When she read it aloud, it sounded almost too simple, but simplicity was no longer a sign of incompleteness. It was a sign of maturity. Theodoros closed his ledger and realized he no longer tracked volatility as an exception. Volatility had become part of structure itself. Marcus stood at the gate beneath a fatting sky, his awareness steady. He no longer interpreted change as disruption. He interpreted it as modulation within continuity. Eleni closed her eyes briefly, feeling the quiet rhythm of the city not as something imposed or managed, but as something arising naturally. And in the palace, the emperor finally acknowledged what had been forming for a long time. The Byzantine Empire was no longer defined by territorial control, political dominance, or centralized authority. It was defined by its role in a distributed equilibrium, a stabilizing presence within a system that no longer required a single organizer. Not weaker, not stronger, but fundamentally recontextualized. Anna closed her documents for the day, aware that what she had written was not an endpoint, but a transitional understanding. Theodoros prepared for tomorrow without expectation of disruption. Marcus remained at his post, no longer guarding against instability, only ensuring coherence. Eleni watched the last light fade from Constantinople, not as a center of power, but as a node of continuity. And the emperor, standing above them all, understood that the empire's greatest transformation was now complete in form, but not in consequence, because systems that achieve distributed stability do not stop evolving. They simply evolve more quietly, and what comes next is never a conclusion, only a deeper phase of the same unfolding structure, a final state that is not final at all, but balanced on the edge of continuous chain. The night over Constantinople felt different in a way. No one could immediately explain, not because anything had changed visibly, but because the way change itself was perceived had finally reached its last transformation. It was no longer something that happened. It was something that was understood as always already happening. Anna realized this first, not through reports, not through correspondence, but through silence. A silence that was not absence of communication, but completion of it. The final layer of her synthesis lay before her on the desk. It described a system that no longer required interpretation in the old sense. Every region, every network, every interaction had reached a level of distributed alignment where stability was not enforced, not guided, but continuously regenerated through mutual adjustment. She read her final summary slowly, then placed the pen down. There was nothing left to correct. At the marketplace, Theodoros closed his stall for what felt like an ordinary evening. Yet, he paused longer than usual, not because of uncertainty, but because he recognized that the world he had worked within for so long no longer depended on his interpretation to function. Trade flowed, prices adjusted, networks balanced themselves, and the empire, once the defining axis of all coordination, was now simply one stable participant among many, not diminished, not elevated, just integrated. He locked the stall and stood for a moment in quiet reflection. There was no question left to ask, only continuity to observe. Marcus, at the gate, no longer watched for patterns. He lived inside them. Movement through the city had become self-explanatory. Travelers arrived already aligned with systems they would interact with. Documentation was no longer processed for correction, but for confirmation of compatibility. His duty remained, but its meaning had changed so completely that it no longer resembled what it once was. He stood still beneath the archway as the wind passed through the stone structure. Nothing required action. Everything required awareness. Inside the palace, the emperor convened no council this time. There was no need. Instead, he stood alone before the great map of the known world. But even that map no longer represented power or hierarchy. It represented relationships, not command lines, but alignment fields, not influence, but coherence density. He studied it quietly, and for the first time, he did not see an empire positioned at the center of history. He saw a structure embedded within it, a stabilizing layer that had learned how to persist not by resisting change, but by becoming part of how change organizes itself. Anna entered the hall behind him, holding no documents. "There is nothing left to report," she said. The emperor nodded. "That is the final stage," he replied. She hesitated. "Final," he corrected himself gently. Not final as an end. Final as a transformation of purpose. They stood together, in silence for a long moment, not as ruler and scholar, but as observers of the same system they were part of. Outside, Constantinople continued its quiet rhythm. Lights flickered across the harbor. Movement passed through streets. Voices carried through the night air. Nothing appeared different, and yet everything had changed in how it functioned beneath itself. Theodoros walked home through familiar streets, realizing that familiarity itself had changed meaning. It was no longer repetition of the past. It was consistency within ongoing evolution. Marcus finally left his post for the night, not because duty ended, but because duty had become continuous rather than episodic. There was no moment of completion, only transition into another phase of awareness. Eleni sat by her window, watching the city without interpreting it. She no longer thought of it as fragile or strong, central or peripheral. It simply was, and in that was, there was a completeness that required no explanation. Inside the palace, Anna placed her final synthesis into the imperial archive. It contained a single consolidated understanding. The Byzantine Empire no longer functions as a central governing force. It exists as a distributed stabilizing reference within a multi-layered system of autonomous coherence. Its survival is not dependent on control, but on continued participation in alignment structures that now self-regulate across regions. She closed the archive and stepped back. The emperor looked at her. "So what do we call this now?" he asked quietly. Anna did not answer immediately, because the question itself no longer had a historical answer. It required a conceptual one. Finally, she said, "A living reference." The emperor considered this, then nodded once. "Yes," he said, "that is what we have become. A reference that does not command, a presence that does not dominate, a structure that does not impose, but still holds coherence by simply existing within it." As night deepened fully over Constantinople, something subtle settled across the city, not silence, not stillness, but resolution without conclusion. The empire had not ended, but it had completed its transformation into something that could no longer be measured by old definitions. It was no longer the center of anything, and yet it was still essential to everything it touched, not because it held power, but because it embodied continuity, and continuity, once fully distributed, no longer needs to announce itself. It simply persists. Anna stood at the balcony beside the emperor one final time, looking over the city that no longer needed to be shaped in order to remain coherent. Theodoros, Marcus, and Eleni each moved through their final moments of the day without awareness of closure, because closure no longer existed in the system they lived within, only continuation. And somewhere beyond institutions, beyond language, beyond even the concept of empire itself, something remained steady, not as memory, not as dominance, but as a pattern that had learned how to sustain itself through alignment rather than control. The Byzantine Empire had not merely survived peacefully, it had dissolved the need to define survival at all. And in doing so, it became something quieter than history, but more enduring than it, a distributed coherence within time itself, a reference that did not end, only continued. And as the last light faded over Constantinople, the story did not conclude. It simply stopped needing a beginning or an ending to remain true, because it had become part of the system it once tried to govern. And now it only continued, without announcement, without center, without end.